Hello and welcome to May's Patreon tutorial video. This will be episode 4, and in this video we will be going through part 2 on perspective. This time focusing a bit more on practical usage of the stuff we've talked about in last month's video. You can go check it out via the link below, and without further ado, let's get right into it. So what do I mean by practical usage? In the last video, we've gone through quite a bit more on the theory side of things, talking about how important perspective is, as well as some ways to use it and some ways to differentiate between core components of it. Like, for example, distance from object, camera focal length, etc. Right? So in this video, we'll try to focus a bit more on the practical aspect of putting that knowledge to use. Like how we start an image, what is the process we go through, like how do we select a perspective that we to use for the image, and etc. So, of course, it starts at a brainstorming stage. Before you even put things down on paper, I would recommend trying to be slightly more rigorous in your idea, right? Like if you have something vague in your mind, I would recommend thinking about it a bit more in perspective, or at least practice doing so. This will really help you familiarize yourself with the idea of how perspective is very noticeable when you have it right, and also very noticeable when it's vague and not done properly. And also, secondly, right, we also have to remember that the whole point of us doing this perspective thing is to use it as a tool, and a very sharpened, well-designed tool, right, to deliver our art. So right before we get into the perspective part of things, right, we have to figure out what is the message that we want to present. What do we want to show people, right? For example, there's a couple of things and keywords here that I usually think about. For example, are we doing a portrait? Are we doing an environment showcase? Or is it a cinematic shot, as in emulating something like a screen cap from a movie? We also have to think about the emotional mood that we're trying to convey in a scene, right? Are we feeling very small in the scene? Are we feeling very big in the scene? Right? Is the scene very distant? Is the scene very intimate? Right? As well as the physical setting itself. For example, are there physical constraints to the environment that we have to work around, or exacerbate, or play or downplay, right? Using perspective tools. And once we know that, right, we can contextualize our use of perspective knowledge to our precise needs that we have just selected. And so, something, for example, right, like we'll start thinking on all these things we've selected and how perspective can help enhance them rather than weaken them, right? Once we have done that, we can start considering our options. So I've taken the liberty to simplify down perspective into basically two sliders you can play with: positioning and focal length. For example, when we talk about positioning, I'm referring to how far the camera is from the focal point or focal object. And with focal length, I'm talking about what kind of lens are we using. Again, right, to know more about these two concepts, I really recommend that you watch the first video on perspective before this one. So of course, as you can see, this is pretty simplified, but the idea here is for me to try and share a bit about how certain options you can make during the planning stage can give you a vastly different visual effect when it comes to drawing the image itself. Of course, these examples are not perfect, but I think I will try my best to explain why each one does what it does. So let's start at the top left. We have a near and wide lens. So when a wide lens is placed quite near the subject, as you can see, there's a lot of distortion going on right in the image itself, as in right in the subject itself, right? Like, for example, this lady's near hand looks really, really big, even though, of course, in reality, we know that the model probably has equally sized hands and is just a regular person. But with wide lens at a close range, we gain this very strong distortion effect that looks very dramatic, right? So this is kind of the idea here. And when we move the camera a little further away, you notice that now we can see the whole body of the character. However, we still see quite a bit of visual distortion because, again, our field of view is quite wide. So you can see how from the nearer part of the concrete and how at a further part of the concrete, the scale is really different, right? Like it really recedes back into the scene, and there's a lot of convergence, distortion in this example. And of course, the idea here is that we capture the character in a bit of a wider scale so you can see the full body, for example, but we also have a bit of dynamic energy going on in the environment itself as well. And for the far wide lens, you'll notice that the character themselves, or the focal point itself, is really just relatively quiet, right? And undistorted and kind of undynamic, really static in the middle of the frame. And the point of a far shot, I feel, sometimes is really to emphasize the surroundings and how they, essentially surround the character that you are, or focal point that you want. As you can see, we can see a lot of things in the periphery, and the character feels really small in the scene. And moving on to medium lens, which is basically kind of like an 80mm lens to a 100mm lens. Not a long lens per se, but definitely no longer in a wide lens. And when we talk about near, the photographer in this shot, for example, is probably about 3 meters away, like crouching down and pointing the camera up. And because it's no longer a very wide lens, we capture a smaller cone of view from a bit further away. So we can basically see a smaller slice of the image with less distortion, right? This is also helpful for relatively more close-up portraits where you don't want the huge distortion in the character's features and proportions, but you still want to show a good bit of depth, right? You do not want the lens compression to be so big that you end up looking like you're taking a long lens shot. So usually a lot of portraits I do is with medium lens focal lengths and fairly nearby. And if we move the medium lens a bit further away, we have this image where you'll notice that the character in the scene is fairly undistorted, right? Like it doesn't suffer from much convergence, distortion, and how the tiles themselves in the foreground really don't distort that much. But the idea here is that we still retain some level of convergence, right? As you can see, the far away part of the airport, I believe, is appearing really small compared to the near part. So you can tell that the camera isn't that far away. And when we take a medium lens and bring a bit further away, we can achieve an almost similar effect to the far wide lens effect, right? Like the one above it. However, you can see the difference here is that the environment feels a little bit more in line with the character, right? There's not so much distortion, and it doesn't feel like the environment is wrapping around you. So it's great to showcase the environment in a bit more of a neutral light versus in a more encompassing and big feeling manner in wide lens mode. And moving down to long lens, and when we have a long lens that is pretty near a subject, right, we capture even less than the medium or the wide lens, right? Because the long lens focuses on a really small field of view and magnifies it. So in this case, if we have a camera relatively near the character, we capture a very small slice of the character using the long lens. But sometimes that is exactly what we want. For example, I want to show how this character is armed and is approaching a staircase, right? So that's the message I want to convey, and the tool that I use for it is long lens nearby. So when we move the lens of the long lens a bit further back into a medium distance, you realize that we capture more of the frame. However, we also notice that there's less distortion going on in the image itself. For example, you can notice that the near side of the piano almost appears as the exact same size as the far side of the piano, and the person playing the piano looks perfectly in proportion with the size of the piano. And in my opinion, I feel like this particular setup is really great if you want to show everything in direct visual proportion to create a particular visual impact, right? Like you do not want perspective to get in the way. Because let's say, for example, if you want someone standing beside a lion and you want the lion to appear huge, you do not want to have to put your camera near the person, and then because of you using a wide lens, right, the person appears huge and the lion appears tiny. If you want the lion to appear huge, and the person to appear small, and both of them to also be in frame at the same time. A good way to set this up is using a long lens from a medium distance. Of course, right? If we take it even further to a long distance, it feels even less intimate, right? It feels like you're almost spying on a scene, and of course, that also has its uses, depending on why you want to draw such a scene. For example, you can have a character walking down a street, and if you want to make them look vulnerable, you can try to take your camera and put it in a position where they're looking down from far away, and this is the effect the long lens from far away creates. And of course, right, these are basic options, right? This is really a simplified checklist for you to run through to have a handle on what kind of options you may want to choose and prompt you to think a bit more about it. Of course, right, that's not all. We also have to consider the camera angle or the camera height, because the height of the camera placement also conveys a message, right? We could be far, we could be near, we could use various lenses, but the positioning of the camera itself, right? Like the final example here, right? The camera is at a high angle, and the first example here, the camera is at a low angle, right? So we want to talk a bit more about camera height as well. Of course, as you can see, these are various combinations and examples that we have here. Now we have a low height of the camera, aka a low angle, but we have a wide lens and it's fairly close. So we end up with the floor or the ground area being very much huge, appearing right in the foreground and then receding back. And in the second image, right, we're using a longer lens from a mid distance and from a lower angle as well. However, as you can see, there's not very much convergence going on. The head of the character is still pretty much in proportion with her feet, and the bricks are about the same size, top and bottom, and basically convergence is very low. Again, this is kind of like say a person suddenly appears, the villain appears on a balcony, right, and you zoom in on the villain. This is to kind of give the feeling that you're far away and then you're like a spectator in the audience and you suddenly see a villain pop up. So you kind of get this effect, right? And then if we have a normal height camera with a wide lens and a mid distance, right, it gives for a bit more of a neutral look. However, it still keeps the scene fairly in depth, right? As you notice, even though the character looks kind of undistorted, right, it's mainly because the character is kind of standing up and it's not really receding back into the scene per se, right? However, there's a lot of depth going on if you pay attention to the ground, right? As you can see here, there's a lot of space on the ground here and we get a very good view of it. And that is an area of the image that you make use of, right? If we have a very fancy ornamental floor, or there's a battle scene and there's a lot of injured people on the floor or dead people, they can all be part of this scene thanks to the fact that we are using a wide lens. So it does add a bit more dynamic element to the scene. And lastly, when we take a wide lens shot from mid distance and from above a character, right, we get also an encompassing feeling as with before, because the wide lens makes the scene feel a bit more dynamic, right? And we feel like the person is actually kind of small in this big scene. And I think the images themselves really kind of explain the mood they convey, right? And for a second set of examples, from a low height and a wide lens and a close distance, we can see there's huge distortion, which is excellent for this photo, right? Because we're showcasing how this character is gripping the sword. So we want the hands and the motion of the hands grabbing the hilt of the sword to be very prominent. And this is exactly what this effect does. And let's say we're drawing an alleyway and we want to make sure we show how long the alleyway is, right? We do not want to visually compress it. We want to show exactly how long and wide this alleyway is. So we use a wide lens and then we take a photo from essentially a long distance, right? Like imagine our character is standing halfway down the street in the middle. And of course we take it at a middle height because in this particular photo, the idea is to kind of show you the street as it is if you were a person standing there. So, right, the eye level height makes perfect sense. And then for the next photo, you can see this is just as what we were talking about before. If you want to showcase a villain in a high place, he's standing above the crowd, right? You want to give the effect that you're using a long lens from a middle or far distance, right? Looking up at them. You're not very intimate with the current situation. You're really just someone gazing up at the situation that is going on, which has its uses, of course. And lastly, similarly, right, we have a high height, wide lens, and mid distance, essentially capturing the same pose but making it a bit more dynamic. As you can see, the leg of the character really stretches out close to the camera, and so do the rocks and the waves, right? It adds a bit of dynamism to the image, which sometimes can be what you want, but that is, of course, as always, a decision for you to make. So now that we've seen a few examples for how these camera settings per se, right, can really affect the image and change the message that you're trying to convey, I want to cover two examples I've just sketched in to really just showcase how they do their work, right? Even in a very rough stage, I feel like just by applying these principles, right, you get a good start to your ability to make sure the perspective works in your favor for your image. So for the first one, we're going to be going through a camera that is placed high in the scene, so from a high angle, and using a wide lens and a mid distance to give the viewer a commanding view of the situation, to allow them to take in the details and enjoy the details for what they are, without being too focused or too far drawn back, right? With a mid distance positioning of the camera. So without further ado, this is a very quick scene that I have sketched up, right? There's basically a couch in a room, and there are windows, and there's a plant in the corner, and there's a briefcase on the sofa, right? And the point of this very simple setup is to essentially showcase to people this particular room. There's nothing extremely exciting going on in this room, and the attention is directed towards how interesting the environment itself is, right? For example, we have a chance to showcase little bits of interesting stuff outside the windows, on the floor, right, on the sofa itself, or something going on in the briefcase. Maybe, right, it's leaking a gas or something, something interesting can take place in this scene, but the viewer is encouraged to look at the scene as a whole from a more relaxed point of view, right? And the wide lens allows us to capture more of the scene, so we can feel like we're in the scene itself. As you can see in our peripheries, and the middle distance also help us, add to that effect as well. And of course, right, the idea is that since we're in a room, we cannot actually be in a camera position outside the room, right? That will either imply this room has no ceiling, which actually could be, a great scenario to design, right? You could be looking in a room with a ceiling that's missing, and to do that, you simply use a long lens from a long distance, and you can easily create that effect. Right. However, in this case, we actually want this to be a normal room, so we use a camera that is in the room, stuck on the ceiling with a wide lens, and looking down at it to create this effect. And for the second example image, right, we use a low angle from a low height with a long lens shot from a long distance. Now, the immediate difference you can see between these two images is that there's a lot less convergence here. Now, let me just quickly put together a perspective grid for you guys so we can see exactly what I mean. Of course, you can draw this perspective grid manually. Simply extend out your edge groups that you have found. Like, for example, we have a huge edge group here that is the floor of this apartment. You can use that as a major edge group, and then align the scene based on that, right? So you can create perspective lines using big dominant edges like that. So as you can see, if we blank out the screen here, there's quite a lot of convergence going on, right? Like the green lines are clearly at very different angles as we go from left to right and right to left. So this is generally a characteristic we find when we are near an image or using a wide lens that captures a wide field of view. Things on the side of our field of view, in the corners and the peripheries, are really going to have this effect applied to them. Right? So, and the difference between that and this is that suddenly you realize, now let me repeat the process for this. And perhaps you can already see it pretty obviously, right? Like the lines are actually very, very much parallel to each other. There's almost no convergence going on in the scene. And if I highlight it, right, so you can pretty much see the lines are essentially parallel, right? From left to right and top to down, the angle of the line barely changes, right? This is usually what happens when we look at an object that is very far away. And because that is very far away, convergence distortion does not apply very much and it's not very visible to us within the object itself, right? So I have explained a lot more on this in the first video. So if you want me to clarify a bit more, it's all there in the first video. And so the point of this particular scene and how we design it is from a low height, we want it to feel like we are looking up at something that we can't quite get a shot of clearly, right? We want to look at when we want to invoke a sense of mystery to the viewer. We do not want them to feel concerned because we are not looking down on the scene, right? We're not looking. There's no sense of vulnerability to the character or the person in this particular window in the scene. So we want people to feel curious about the scene with our low angle shot, and then we use a long lens and a long distance to make people feel and essentially lie to them in a sense to make them believe they are looking at the scene from very far away, because this is exactly how the scene would appear if they looked at it from far away, right? So we emulate that, take the key characteristics of the lens and the distance, apply them to the image, and then create this illusion that we're looking up at this well-lit room from far away. And if we use an even longer lens, right, even more lens with even larger focal length, we can even create this effect, right, where all these lines are still perfectly parallel to each other. There's no convergence, and everything is proportionate to scale. It immediately creates a more unsettling feel of a spy really just zooming into a particular shot from really far away, right? So hopefully these two examples really kind of showed you how choosing the right lens, positioning your camera at the right distance, and using a high or low angle really, really, really helps convey your message in a different way. And this is kind of what I mean when we apply perspective practically, we can make use of it in a lot of ways to serve our own message. And if anything, personally, I find sometimes that using perspective in this way actually inspires me to think about certain scenes and certain scenarios that can be actually very interesting to draw. Right, so hopefully that is the kind of the lesson that I'm giving off here. So here are also some tips, some simple quick tips when we are doing the drafting, when we are implementing our perspective solution into our sketch. So firstly, it's very important to determine your eye level. So how exactly are you looking at the subject matter, right? Let's say you're drawing a character who is standing in the alley. Are you looking at a character from above, from normal human eye level, or from below the character, right? Or any other specific eye level you choose. Let's say you're drawing at eye level at the knees of the character, right? So to help yourself anchor yourself into the scene, you can simply draw your horizon line and then align elements that are at that particular level and then draw them all along the line itself. So for example, if you're at knee level, you can simply mark down the character's knees to be at that horizon line. And other things like you can add in that situation will be chairs. Generally speaking, the seats of chairs are generally also at standing knee levels. So right, you can draw in the seats of chair, you can draw in the character's knees and help anchor yourself into the image. And then of course, we also want to identify major edge groups in the scene. For example, if we have large edge groups like the ground itself or walls, you want to take account to them because they are also what guides a lot of smaller elements, right? Small elements are generally aligned relative to these huge important surfaces, right? In this case, we call them edge groups because they are parallel edges in reality. And so once we identify those, we can then draw them in accurately and then apply the characteristics of our perspective options to them, right? So as we have seen previously, whether convergence is apparent or is it very hidden, those vary across our perspective options, right? So we want to pay attention to our major edge groups, and because that is where most of our perspective choices are going to shine through and express themselves, right? Within these major edge groups, major surfaces, and our eye level. And of course, during the process, after you've identified some of these major edge groups, feel free to use a perspective tool that I've recommended, or you can just create a grid manually, and it takes a little bit longer, but it works just as well. And lastly, as I've said in the previous video, don't be too worried about 1, 2, or 3 point perspective, right? Set up your scene as you should, as it is in reality. Apply your perspective choices, your camera positioning choices, and then just go from there, right? Do not worry too much about whether you're fitting into any kind of so-called 1, 2, or 3 point perspective. And of course, sometimes things don't work out perfectly on the first try, and therefore I also have some backup solutions. So for example, number one, we would try to create a floor plan diagram, right? Let's say we're drawing a complex scene, we're no longer sure halfway through whether we are in front of that object, behind this object, are we to the left of this object, can we actually see in view, right? Is the object too high up to be in view, or are we drawing it such that it's wrong? A lot of questions like that arise, so it's always good to have a floor plan diagram if you are in trouble. And what the floor plan diagram is basically a simple blueprint, right? It's like, say, a blueprint of a room, and you can include the top, side, and front views to solve the problem. And what happens is that you can now refer to it to essentially anchor yourself with more items, right? To quickly demonstrate, let's say we have a very complicated scene here, like not really complicated, but let's say we have a simple scene here, right? Like we are at floor level, and then this is like the entrance, right? We're in a subway, and this is the entrance to the outside. And then there are like lots of people outside. Like this is a subway scene, right? This is a simple subway scene. And then if we are unclear about what's going on in this scene, we can draw a simple sketch. So this is a top-down view. Our camera is here, demarking our field of view. And then we have person A, person B, person C, and then we can dot the people in the scene around. And then let's say we have a parked bicycle here, or some kind of object here, and then an object here. So what happens is that when we have this blueprint, right, we can we can use this blueprint to help us know exactly what is obscured and what is not. So for example, from this image, right, we can clearly see that, let's say the object here, right, we have this object here on the left side. And we notice that because we project our lines out like this, we have a couple of people blocking the view of most of the object. So we can only really show a tiny bit of it here, right? Which is what we show here, because these people are blocking the object on the left side, right? So this is just a quick example of how these kind of blueprint images can really help you figure out, especially when things get obscured, right? Same thing with a side view, right? Let's say with the side view and our cam is here, we are on the floor looking up, and then we have a person walking in front of our camera, and a person walking in front of camera, person walking in front of camera. And then let's say we have a signboard here, right? We have a signboard here. By using this image, we will immediately notice that the person's head is blocking out, a good bit of signboard from our position. So how do we introduce it to this image, right? So let's say we have a signboard here. And because there's a person in front of us, and we know from the blueprint that they are blocking a chunk of the signboard, right? We can now we can correct it like this. And this is also very helpful because in blueprint view, you can actually designate and figure out exactly how tall something is, how short something is. Everything is in perfect proportion, right? So if you take this and use a blueprint image to determine your proportions, and figure out what is obscure, what is not obscure, etc. Right? And you apply to this image, you're going to have a very easy time drawing everything in proportion, in perspective. So this is what I mean by create a floor plan diagram to help you when you feel that things are out of proportion, things are out of whack. And of course, another backup solution is reverse engineer your desired look, right? I think this is somewhat self-explanatory. So if you want to draw and capture a particular effect, like a lot of times you see me drawing worm's eye view because I want to show people, say, things about the floor, like it's a rainy day and the floor is very wet. And I want to show that the floor is very wet in a close-up. I can simply start with that, right? I can reverse engineer. I want to start with the floor. Or if I want to showcase a particular, say, a giant wall mural from a certain perspective, I start with that first, and then reverse engineer from there, and then apply the perspective that I want, right, to the rest of the image, right? And if you have several items in an image that you want to show, or more items in the image that you want to show, you can anchor the sketch with these ideas. And then you can fill in the blanks and then have a equally coherent perspective solution to your image, right? The difference is that you're starting with things that you know you want. And of course, we're almost at the end. So if there are still problems, right, I have a quick troubleshooting checklist here. And of course, one thing to note is that sometimes you could have drawn the scene very accurately, but it ended up not being something you want, right? So for these two first conditions, you want to verify the image is actually what you want to achieve, right? We'll talk about reverse engineering, right? Because sometimes you can engineer it normally and then find out that, hey, it did not appear as I expected it to. So sometimes you may be missing out on your original aim, right? For example, if you want to draw a character from this angle because you think it looks cool, but it turns out that it just looks weird, you could have drawn it perfectly accurately, right? But it just doesn't look good, right? Same reason as why there are like premium or better angles in portrait photography in reality, right? And you also want to check that with your current setup, right? Are you able to present the depth, layering, or forms that you want to show the image as intended? Or are you accidentally creating an optical illusion? Remember that optical illusions can exist in reality as well, right? That accidentally flattens the image too much. So that is one thing that also you want to pay attention to. Of course, there are situations where you did not manage to draw the image accurately, and that's where the problem comes from, right? So you want to find out, are there parts of the image that should be conforming to the grid you've prepared, but aren't? So let's say you've set up a grid, you've drawn everything in, but for one particular area, because you haven't stayed on the grid for a while, because you haven't checked the grid for a while now, it's a bit off, and now your whole image looks off. So you have to verify that first, and then you want to make sure that they are conforming to the grid. When I say vice versa, I mean the grid only can help with objects in the scene that actually align to it, right? So if your object that isn't supposed to be aligned to it, like if you want to draw a poster that is slanted or peeling off the wall, you can't use the perspective grid of the wall to draw the same poster because it's no longer aligned to it, right? And if you align it to it, if you align the poster to it forcefully, it's just going to look weird. So pay attention to that. And then also, are there parts of the image that do not follow the grid? That they do follow the grid, right? Are there parts of the image that do follow the grid, but unfortunately do not respect the distance and the length's focal length? I.e., we intended it for it to be a long lens shot, so everything has this lens compression look going on about it, right? As we have said in the previous video, at a long distance, when we shoot something, the distortion, or rather convergence, is very little across a long distance. So if we do not match that correctly, right? And that is something that the perspective grid doesn't tell us, so we have to remember, right? And respect the distance and the focal length that we are currently using. And of course, one of the things that we can do is to realign the major elements of the image using solid angle references, right? As I've said before, everything at eye level should be eye level, everything at, whichever eye level you choose, right? You have to be clear and you want to use things that at the eye level to help anchor the rest of the image. So for example, if you're drawing something 50 meters away, but still at your eye level, you still want to pay attention to make sure that the things that should be at your eye level are at your eye level. and respect the camera as with before. And lastly, also, especially when drawing characters, right, you want to be careful that you're not drawing them by muscle memory. So if you draw characters a lot at from above or from below, but you switched up the angle to a bit more of an extreme angle or shallower angle, you want to be careful that you're not just drawing them by muscle memory. You want to figure out exactly how they would appear at that particular angle. So these are just a couple of common things that I found that really helped me to troubleshoot my stuff. So I will be attaching that in the post below as well. And lastly, since some of you asked for a couple of learning exercises to help on perspective, this is what I feel like I can recommend. So this is basically identification practice, right? In order to be able to really internalize the lesson and practice it, you have to have some practice identifying, i.e. being able to look at an image and tell, okay, so is this a long lens shot? Is this a wide lens shot? How far away is this image being shot from? So this is what I mean by identification. And how do we begin? Personally, I would prefer to start with a set of reference photos, right? And with a large variety in camera setup. You could use different screen caps from different movies that you like, or you can just search up Pinterest. Any photo really just works, right? But preferably with a large variety of camera, right? Camera setups and perspective setups. And from each photo, try to identify 3 different things: camera eye level, focal length of the camera being used, and distance from the focal point or focal character, right? So if there's a character in frame, try to figure out how far the camera is and the camera crew is from the character that is being shown. Right. Of course, a helpful tip to do this is to go and look at the convergence that is going on in that region where the character is standing. So let's say we're looking at a character standing 50 meters away and we're shooting her or him with a long lens. So we can look at the tiles near their feet or objects near them. Is there a lot of convergence, distortion going on? If not, right, it suggests that they are further away, and vice versa. Right, once you're done with that, try to compare the images to each other. It's great it's even better if you have your own camera or you know the details of the image that are being shot, right? But if not, it's totally fine. You can just compare them to each other and make sure that at least relatively you know what's going on. So you can clearly tell which lens is wider, right? You may not be able to tell whether it's exactly a 24mm lens or a 50mm lens, but as long as you can tell one is wider than the other, it's a very good starting point, right? And so on and so forth. Of course, sometimes images can be cropped, but try your best to identify the features through them as well. So, i.e., don't worry too much about it. Just try your best to kind of figure out and get your hands dirty looking at images and try your best to kind of think about these 3 characteristics and these 3 properties, right? At the end of the day, hopefully this will help you be able to interpret and use reference accurately as well. Because you have to use, when you pick up a reference and you look at it and you extract visual information from it, right? Sometimes we get a bit carried away and we look at very pixel-based ideas, or rather pixel-based measurements, right? But we want to be able to interpret it properly because we want to know the perspective properly so we can actually tell what's going on in the reference image before we can actually use it. And because otherwise, we'll end up either extracting a reference from a perspective that is very different from our own, which means we don't actually know what it looks like in our reference, in our perspective, right? Or vice versa. So we want to be careful with that, and then hopefully with sufficient practice on that, right, we can then apply that skill to our own work. And so that will be all for this video. I really have to say this is a lot of stuff for me to explain as well. So I really appreciate that everyone has the patience to kind of sit through it and try to figure out what I'm talking about. Because again, I'm not an expert lecturer or a teacher of art. I'm just trying my best to share what I've learned, and hopefully you will find this a little bit helpful. And thanks again for your support, and I hope to see you next month.